The Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show. Free your mind, and the rest will follow. A show for all who are on the journey to discover the truths about their identity, history, culture, politics, spirituality, and family relationships. This is a show for the Black Freedom Movement and the Black Power generation and the hip-hop generation, including Black Lives Matter and associate activists, all of whom are seeking change. Dr. Oba T'Shaka and his guest are dropping knowledge and insight from his successful organizing, research, writings, and innovative thoughts, the best of which have piped into God's mind to lift you up higher and higher. To the bosses, OGs, rappers, influencers, and those looking to evolve from the constraints of misinformation and miseducation to build a foundation for personal growth, love, and mental freedom. Check out the wisdom of the O.R. Yeah, that's the original revolutionary, Oba T, who inspired 1 million black men with his rousing speech at the Million Man March, and who continues to fight, write, and speak the truth. Dr. Oba T'Shaka is one of the deepest deep thinkers in the world today. A quote by Dr. Asa Hilliard. Dr. Oba T'Shaka, then Bill Bradley, was the best leader organizer in the Congress of Racial Equality, C.O.R.E. An endorsement from Dr. George Wiley, Associate Director of National C.O.R.E. and the best organizer blacks produced in the 1970s as the organizer of the National Welfare Rights Organization. The Dr. Oba T'Shaka Show.
Good morning. This is Dr. Oba T'Shaka, and this is the 9th of the Dr. Oba T'Shaka shows. This show will focus on the spiritual blues, one of the most magnificent art forms, the foundation at least of one of the most beautiful art forms on the planet Earth. The last 2 shows have focused on preparations for African identity, part 1 and part 2. And this last show that you saw was a presentation that I did at Merritt College, the home of the Black Panther Party. They gave birth to the first Black Studies department at a 2-year university. And so that was a discussion of the fact that we have a culture, because as you saw in that presentation, and those of you that haven't seen it, check it out. A lot of our people think still that we don't have a culture, and these are young black folks. So today we'll focus on the spiritual blues. You'll see why I don't call it just the spirituals. You'll see that later. In part 1, I made the point that African American culture, or what I prefer to call New African culture, was created not by the elite, as most cultures are. Most cultures are created by the intellectual class. This culture of Africans in America, what I call New African culture, because it's a blend of what comes from Africa and then new things that we've developed in this country, new principles, new ideas, and a new spirit that comes forth in the art form that we have, but always with an African foundation. So in the case of Africans in America, the culture was created by everyday black folks. As I pointed out before, field blacks. And it comes from their feelings, it comes from their heart, it comes from their soul. But most importantly, they are the creators of this culture because they're the most African among our people to this day. Not from the house slaves. and not from the intellectual class, because we had very few then, but even now, that intellectual class has to go back to these roots to get their views straight, to get their heads wrapped on right. So we're going to be focusing on the second creation of field blacks, and that was the art form. The art form that Europeans call the spirituals. We'll see that these terms don't really apply, but I don't feel that it's fitting for me to rename these. That's for the artists to do. But this art form that we have created was created in the midnight of hell. Black folks who are catching more hell from can see to can't see than you could ever imagine. It is an amazing thing that they could find within their souls and their spirits this vision to create not only a culture that was both old and new based on African principles but reformulated in this reality, but that they could also create an art form. What enslaved African people have ever done that before? And that should tell you something about the mentality of the people that created this. This is a magnificent creation. But then if you consider that the culture that everyday black people created is now the popular culture of the United States and the world. And we can also say the classical culture of the world. That's jazz, the pinnacle of this art form. But its foundation is the spiritual blues. So what an amazing people that in hell could come up with something so heavenly. Truly amazing, phenomenal accomplishment. But still, you might ask, why are you dealing with what you call the spiritual blues when you're dealing with the guidelines for awakening? What has that got to do with awakening? And what I'd like to point out to you is this, that in the sixfold stages to mental freedom, the process for freeing your mind that Malcolm went through, that I went through, that a whole lot of awakened black folks went through, which means that at one point they were asleep, that this system of awakening was always a twofold process. It was a process once we began to think for ourselves, where we began to go back to our roots, which is the roots of Africa. And so that was the beginning of our awakening. But if I speak about my own awakening, occurring in 1963, see, anytime anything significant happens in your life, you may not remember the day. You may not remember the month. You'll definitely remember the year, and you'll remember exactly what you were doing at that time. And the thing that I remember most about this awakening was that it was my first time to feel mentally free, because I began to think for myself. And as I then began to plunge into my African history, I began to also plunge into my African American history and culture. But at the same time that I went into the depths of our history and our culture, I was at the same time returning to the blues. You see, in my awakening and in the awakening of most of the blacks who woke up in the 60s and since then and before, there was no separation between the great pyramids of Kemet and Aretha Franklin, James Brown, and Otis Redding. If you look at the Black Arts movement that sprung up in the late 60s and early 70s, all those great poets basically were drawn off of jazz. And Amiri Baraka, one of the great poets of this country, who wrote a magnificent work called Blues People, was also drawn off the blues. So you see, I call myself a spiritual blues man. My daddy is from a little place in Louisiana called Bunkie, Louisiana. It's so small that if you drive through that community, close your eyes, you'll miss it. And he was born in a shack that could barely stand on its foundation and worked a plantation in Orange, Texas, where I've told you before he whipped the behind of the owner's son and earned his respect, but risked his life. So I'm the son of W.H., coming from Bunkie, Louisiana, and the grandson of Catherine Filarty and Sylvia Brown from Mississippi, the birthplace of the blues. So I'm a spiritual blues man. And you see, when blacks were coming over on the slave ships, there was a spirit that came with them. And that spirit was in the form, I talked about it before, of Brer Rabbit. This little rabbit that could outfox the fox. But very often, Brer Rabbit was the outer picture of the real thing they carried, which was High John the Conqueror. They call him the Conqueror in the blues. It means the conqueror. And that was the warrior spirit. And while my daddy is W.H. from Bunkie, my spiritual father is High John the Conqueror, the spirit of the spiritual blues, the spirit of black folks. And High John the Conqueror was Nat Turner, was Denmark Vesey, was Harriet Tubman. It was those Africans who stood up boldly and did their best to free their people from physical, spiritual, and mental enslavement. And so my spiritual father is the one that I feel, along with my daddy, that has inspired me to engage in a struggle not only to free my mind, but to engage in a struggle against the forces that oppress our people. So the spiritual blues is inseparable from the movements that we have carried out for liberation, not only on the plantation, but if you look at the movements for change in this country, singing has always gone along with swinging. Malcolm often said, because he was critical of the singing, because he was in the Nation of Islam. Now, he had been a Lindy Hopper. He loved jazz, and if you loved the jazz, you loved the blues. And he even found out when he woke up, at least on the streets, at least he got out of that white world. He hadn't got completely awakened. In the Lindy Hop, he found what he called his African freedom through those African rhythms. And so Malcolm, he tried to say that, well, you know, those movements in the South that were up there singing, they weren't swinging. And as much as I love Brother Malcolm, I got to correct him on that. Because when he said Muhammad Ali didn't win the heavyweight championship of the world by singing, he won it by swinging. I would beg to differ. And I would say that when he said, float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, Muhammad Ali, Muhammad was singing. And when he said to a fellow boxer, you're going to heaven in 7, that was poetic music. Black folks have music in everything we do. That's our African heritage. You hear me? And the poetry is at the heart of the music. The spiritual blues is the foundation, along with the culture of Native Americans, of the original poetic form of this country. The poetry of this country comes from the spiritual blues and all the creations that flow from that, as well as Native American music, Native American culture, which is the music of the air, the music of water, the music of nature. Absolutely beautiful. So why the spiritual blues when we're talking about awakening? Because if you don't go to the high point of your culture, you are not going to experience true mental freedom. So again, why the spiritual blues? The spiritual blues is the most beautiful aspect of the culture our people have created. The great philosopher of China, Confucius, reserved as the highest plane of his philosophy of Confucianism, which wasn't really his own ideas, but the summation of the three dynasties of China, Hsia and Shang, both of which were black, and then Chao, which was Asian. And he was a musician. And so the deepest part of the culture of Confucianism, which is the culture of ancient China with a black foundation, was in the music. The people who are ancestral to the Aztecs, the Toltec people of Mesoamerica, the Toltec people found the expression that could best capture God, the Spirit of God, in what they called flower and song. Flower was poetry, and of course song was music. All high cultures reserve the highest space for music. Great music. And so why the spiritual blues? Because it's the pinnacle of the culture. In the midnight of hell, our people saw a necessity to not only bring in a lot of Africa into the culture, but then went one step further and said, let's take it to another place. One of the missions of both African American or New African culture and the art form, and this is something that almost all our people say, is to bring beauty where there's ugliness. Those of us who think that slavery dehumanized us are confusing the conditions of dehumanization with being dehumanized. Guess who was dehumanized? Those that inflicted it upon us. Guess who was savage? Those who engaged in that kind of behavior. But the African spirit was. And you hear everyday black people saying it all the time, baby, the one thing I'm not going to be is like them. You hear me? And that is the root of the souls of black folks. So why the spiritual blues? It brings beauty where there's ugliness. And the poorest of us are the greatest. Because as they say in Jamaica, the culture comes from the dirt, the grassroots, everyday black folks. So why the spiritual blues? The spiritual blues is so powerful that in New African culture, every part of the culture is inspired by this musical form. And why is it that it's music that is at its highest level? Because the drums were outlawed. And when those African drums were outlawed, it required us to go inside our soul and create something new. And so our emphasis became on the drum beat of the voice, the clap of the hands, the stomp of the feet. But the sound of the voice, it's not that we came here with more singers, but the conditions brought that out. So if you look at the creative expressions of Africans in America, what you will find is that every domain is inspired by the music. Toni Morrison, inspired by jazz. In fact, I would say the more complex your creation is, the more likely it is you're going to be drawn from jazz. Malcolm X was a deep thinker. he was a jazz thinker. You hear me? Richard Wright come out of the mud, the red mud of Mississippi. So what else could his writings be but blues-based? And James Baldwin said that his writings were inspired, by jazz. And I understand why, because he was a deep thinker. Only person I saw ever beat Malcolm in a debate. Because Malcolm was coming from, the Nation of Islam line. And James Baldwin coming from the streets. The streets will always beat a line. So his depth was definitely jazz. But if you want to look at the beauty of it, its greatest beauty came from gospel blues. He was raised up in the church and couldn't help it. The titles even of his books were generally gospel-based. Fire next time. You know what I mean? So the thing is, if you look at George Washington Carver, he wasn't just the world's greatest scientist. If he chose to be, he would have been the world's greatest painter, the world's greatest musician, and one of the world's greatest singers. He brought art to science because the greatest musician, the greatest artist, the greatest creator of music is God, that force. And this man was piping into God all the time. So you got to understand, why the spiritual blues? It's your high point. It's your bridge over troubled waters. It's your inspiration when you don't think you have any at all. And another thing to get straight about the spirituals and the blues is some have characterized the spirituals as being sorrow songs. W.B. Du Bois said that. Now, Du Bois had some of the deepest insights on the culture, but he was wrong on that. These are not sorrow songs. And if you look at the blues, this is not the blues. In fact, that term blues comes from white people. What black person who's black as midnight going to call his music blue? You understand? He's already blue. So why would he call it? That's a white boy's term. So the blues ain't all sad. And the spirituals definitely ain't all sorrowful, because African culture always cuts many ways. And so when you're down, you also feel like you're going to come up. As the spiritual song says, sometimes I'm up, sometimes I'm down. Oh yes, Lord. But generally, the whole spirit of the spiritual blues and the art form that created this is that in the most pessimistic circumstances, you have a feeling that things will get better. Now, if you look at white blues, country music, because whites in the South who hate blacks, not all of them, but too many of them with a passion, they come up with a music that sounds like a barnyard chicken. It's got beauty in it because it's half of the blues, but it's the sad part. You hear me? And so even though there's a beauty to it, it's always about the down situation. And as a result, country blues is associated with suicide. You ain't hearing no black man who's singing about God or the black woman thinking about committing suicide. You hear me? So this is a music that will pull you up no matter how far down you have gone. So why the spiritual blues? The spiritual blues, like all great music, is the window into the soul of a people. If you want to know a people, know their music. Their music will tell you everything you need to know about them. If you look at operatic music, which I know a lot of black people like, and it's going to sound like I'm down in it. No, I'm not, because it's good for the people that created it, the aristocrats. That's why few people listen to it. You know what I mean? In fact, Wynton Marsalis, who I rarely quote, was asked once, well, why is black music so popular, but white music isn't, classical music? And he said, well, any music that deals with man, woman, and God has got to be interesting, meaning your stuff ain't about anything we can relate to. but it is aristocratic music created by the elite, for the elite. But ours comes from the bowels, the heart and soul of everyday black folks. And so the creators of this music we call the folk. It comes from the folk culture. And folk culture in all cultures is generally rural. It comes from the people in the country, the people closest to the roots. And here's the thing about the folk. It's a mirror to how the culture was created, because over time, as people underwent the experience of enslavement, over time it forged us into a people. And that peoplehood was in part shaped by embracing race consciousness. It was shaped by pulling in those principles out of Africa that could enliven us and give us strength to go on. So that was part of what the spiritual blues was about with the folk. But over time, what happens here is what happens all over the world with the folk. They form a mindset that is unique to them. I call us the 97 percenters. Until recently, 97% of us married black. When we really stand up, 97% of us in the Montgomery bus boycott stood up and broke the back of Southern segregation. 96% of blacks voted for Barack Obama the first time. I'm here to tell you something. 96% of nobody except Native Americans. By the way, in this last election, 99% of them in Arizona voted against Trump. Now, that says something about your Native American brothers and sisters, who were the only allies we had during enslavement. So we're 99 percenters because in spite of all the confusion, in spite of all the mess that we see around us, and some of this is black mess, a few of us killing too many of us, some of us still not getting to the point where we learn to love ourselves, and this is a part of what this whole journey is about. Still, when you get down to it, there's a one mind. And that one mind, when we focus on it, makes us one of the strongest forces on this planet Earth. And so, if we look at the folk, the key thing to understand about the folk is this. They don't suffer from double consciousness. That's Du Bois's concept of seeing yourself through somebody else's eyes. That's some house slaves, a lot of them, love the master more than they love themselves. Would identify with the master, as Malcolm said, if the house was burning down, they'd be the first one to put out the fire, whereas the field black said it and was hoping that the thing would succeed and burn the whole thing down. You understand? So double consciousness, where you're seeing yourself through someone else's eyes, so you can't see your beauty except for the perception of someone else. And a lot of us have some problems to deal with that. To the degree that we do, we got to get rid of it. But for the most part, field blacks don't suffer from double consciousness because the folk do not care 2 cents about the sensibilities of white people. The culture, and particularly the art form that they created, is designed to suit them, to suit their taste, to suit their emotions, to suit what will really pick them up. There was an old enslaved African who said this, and very few blacks on the plantation were Christians. And I don't know if she was, but they had these old preachers come on. And this was probably after Nat Turner's rebellion, because these old white preachers would come on. Before that, the black preachers could come on. And when the black ones came on, they were under supervision. So she said, those old white preachers ain't saying nothing, because all they do is speak with their mouth. But she said, when that black man preaches, she said it's like heaven. She says, because what he's got to say comes from the heart, the soul. There's another slave narrative that said this, and it's the only one probably in all the narratives, because black folks didn't reveal to white folks. In those interviews, the WPA Work Project Administration interviews that occurred in the 1930s under Franklin Delano Roosevelt, usually conducted by white folks. Black folks who are ex-slaves, they wouldn't tell white people, half of what they thought. But one slave narrative said this, and this tells you what this one mind thing is that we formed. They said this: only the blacks can move the blacks. You hear me? That's profound truth, because you can't show me one major mass movement that was launched with black people in it, led by white people. You can't show me one. Don't talk about who we voted for. That's a lesser of two evils. I'm talking about movements we led. Who'd we follow? The Honorable Marcus Garvey, the Honorable Elijah Muhammad. When we're looking at King, he was a spokesperson for the people who took that up. Why? One mind. And what we understand with this one mind, that this represents us. So why the spiritual blues? It's a heart of our people. It's the window inside your soul. It shows you the greatness that you have within yourself. Now, the key thing about the spiritual blues is, like New African culture in general, it has an African foundation. Leopold Senghor, who was president of Senegal, who was also the head of the Negritude movement, which was the Afrocentric movement in French or Francophone countries where Africans spoke French. He was an intellectual, a poet. He made an observation about the spirituals. He said the melodies of the spirituals are the same as the melodies of Africa. And then he also said they have the same sentiment. I would add that when this music was first being sung, first created, it was sung in the same syntax and accent of West Africa. And the proof of the pie is in the pudding. They have the McIntosh County singers who today still do the old spiritual blues. And they do it with a West African accent. The accent of somebody who is learning this language, but the African language predominates. And we call that Ebonics now, because later the spiritual blues gets inflected into this Niger-Congo Bantu speech pattern that is what 85% of black folks speak in this country. And it's not broken English. It's based on African linguistic rules, and it's a hieroglyphic language full of color. You hear me? If we're going to bury somebody, we don't say we're going to the funeral. We say we're going to funeralize him, because that's what you call turning a noun into a verb, a verbal noun, because action is always what's primary with us. Being what you're talking about is central. And so the sensibilities that Senghor talked about was the sensibilities of being what that music expresses. And when he talked about the melodies that you find in the spiritual blues are the melodies coming out of Africa. What were they? There's a song called Wade in the Water. Wade in the water, children. God's gonna trouble the waters. I ain't gonna sing because I ain't no great singer. I know not to mess this up. But guess what? That was an Igbo song. And the Igbo were called the Flying Africans. And what were they doing? They were going to the water to drown, because they came out of a free system. The Igbos had no kings telling them anything, though most kings in Africa were part of a democratic system. And so they could not stand the restrictions, the loss of freedom that came with slavery. And so they went to the water to drown. They were called the Flying Africans, because when they drowned, their souls would return to Africa. So in case you think the spirituals are some white boy's creation, you got it all wrong. The folk went for what they liked, and what they liked was fundamentally African. one of the most beautiful songs created by gospel blues. And gospel blues is nothing but the extension of spiritual blues. Thomas Dorsey is the father of it. But the person that inspired him was Reverend Tinley. Reverend Tinley was the one that set the pattern for him. And so this song, one of the prettiest ones in the spiritual blues, the gospel blues art form, this one was formed after he had undergone the most sad experience of his life, the death of his wife in pregnancy, and then the loss of their child a few days later. And the man was in the saddest state of his life. And one day he sat down at the piano in Chicago, and he had these long fingers, and he started to play some music that became one of the two greatest gospel blues songs ever, Precious Lord. Martin Luther King's favorite song. Mahalia Jackson sang it at the March on Washington. Precious Lord, take my hand, lead me on to the precious land. It went on to how he was weak and God was strong. Well, guess where the melody came from? That was a melody that came from Africa. On the slave ships, Africans would hum that melody. And he put that melody into verse. So what you got to understand is, when we talk about we ain't got no culture, they took our culture from us. What is fundamental about your culture is it is founded on an African foundation. And then based on the experiences that we've had in this country, we've added something new. And that ends up being a special sound that we find in the spiritual blues that pervades all art forms among New Africans. You know, we got black folks who say, I like gospel blues, but I don't like the blues. They don't know what they're talking about. The only difference between the blues and gospel blues is one's about the woman and the other one's about God. But other than that, it's the same story. You hear me? Run around here talking about you don't like it. Same sound and sometimes the same musicians. Because, by the way, Thomas Dorsey was a blues musician playing for Ma Rainey, who then decided to take the blues into the black church. And when he brought it in with Mahalia Jackson singing Precious Lord, and then shaped the greatest male gospel singer of the spiritual or gospel blues, James Cleveland, who comes up with the greatest spiritual blues song ever, Peace Be Still. Master, the tempest is raging. Peace be still. When they went into those churches and sang those songs, Sedity, you know, these middle-class black churches in Chicago that didn't want to do too much hard preaching because they didn't want to bring the spirit down because white people didn't like that. And they were trying to act white. But those people who come from the folk, that's what they wanted. And so when Mahalia and James got in there and started singing those old songs that went back to the plantation, what happened is the spirit began to rise. The hush harbor, which was the place where you put your head under a bucket until the spirit came in you, came down on the place. It was a re-Africanization. So if you think the spiritual blues is just about yesterday, and you want to put it down because it was in slavery, what you got to understand is it's alive today. And what you got to understand is you got nothing to be ashamed of your ancestors. They did nothing but bring on the highest level of culture the world has ever seen. In fact, as Zora Neale Hurston said, the closer to slavery we were, the more African we were. So get it straight. The spiritual blues has an African foundation, as the culture does. The spiritual blues goes back all the way back to the roots of civilization. The C.O.R.E, who give birth to humanity, that is, God makes them the first human beings 144,000 years ago. It goes back that far. That's where our cultural roots go. I've gone over some of this before. And it is the Chwa, Europeans incorrectly call them pygmies, who give birth to the notion of God and the idea of one God. But it's not a killer cult concept. It's not a concept where males are going around trying to impose their stuff on everybody else. No. They describe God as the totality of forces, of which he puts a part in everything it creates. And I call God the light. The spirituals talk about this little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. It's the part of God that's in every one of us. I've seen this light, a magnificent light. Quantum physics confirms this, but as Dr. Theophilo Benga, one of our greatest scholars on ancient Kemet, points out, quantum physics has reached a dead end because they don't know what they're looking at. They don't understand that this is a God force out here that's in a tree, that's in a rock, that's in a leaf, that's in a deer, and is definitely in every human being. And the Chwa give birth to music. The Pharaoh Pepi II, talked about the Chwa as the people who do the dances of God and who sing the songs of God. Why did he say that? Because they're your first musicians, and because they're God's first people, and because they're the most just people on the planet Earth, these hunter-gatherer societies where men didn't oppress women, where the old were not oppressed by the young, and where men spent as much time cuddling and loving their babies as the mothers did. They were the embodiment of truth and justice. So the Chwa, when they understand the nature of God and talk about its the totality of force, music is an expression of that force. It's a vibratory force. As I pointed out before, the great Lakota healer and holy man says of God, because he's visited God for sometimes days at a time, and talks about God being a great white light, says, God's a sucker for music. Because if God is vibrations, what would God love more than anything? The vibrations of truth, the vibrations of justice, and the vibration of beautiful sounds that embody those truths. Pythagoras, who was a Greek philosopher, who was the only one that went through 20 years of Kemetic mystery education, said this. He said the planets all emit musical sounds, but they're of such a high frequency, human ears can't hear them. So God is on the plane of the highest frequency. And so when God hears the spiritual blues, that force has got to have force full of smiles, a force full of happiness, because we've added something new to humanity. Something magnificently beautiful coming from the souls of black folks. So the Chwa are the authors of this. The Chwa had a dance that they performed when they sang. And it was a counterclockwise shuffle where the feet never left the ground. And they said that dance harmonized the heavens with the earth, because they knew that God loved beautiful music and beautiful dance. The African who comes to the Americas and the United States bring this dance, and it's called the ring shout, a counterclockwise dance. Spirituals were always sung to dancing. And they also said, this is the music that harmonizes the cosmos. So the spiritual blues is cosmic music. It's cosmic music that brings healing to the earth. I'm up here in nature where I live, and I get to see the bluebirds every now and then. I saw one this morning. And the prettiest of the bluebirds, I'm sorry, sisters, is that male bluebird because he's got the crown. But they're both beautiful. And so the body of the bluebird is light blue. But the crown is a dark color. And I've noticed when I had the blues on, or the spiritual blues on, I noticed when these little birds are on a branch or something, and they're always looking both ways, looking for that old hawk to come. They always got to be on the lookout, and they're tweeting their beautiful sound. But when the spiritual blues is sung, they go all quiet. The head's moving side to side. The spiritual blues, the creators of it, drew from nature. Twa music was itself a music of the water, of the wind, of nature, high-pitched and beautiful. And so when we look at and hear the spiritual blues, it harmonizes the most beautiful creatures in nature and makes them wonder. Because I notice when they're looking around, I can feel them. I think they're wondering, where did that come from? Because it's not the normal tweet tweet that comes from birds, but it's got a sound that is heavenly. So the spiritual blues connects you to God, as the rest of this culture does, but it's the highest expression of it. Now, because the foundation of the spiritual blues is African, many Africans who came to this country came from West Africa. Some, a significant number, came from the Yoruba ethnic group. You find them in Cuba, you find a significant number of them here, and in other parts of the Western Hemisphere. And the thing about the Yoruba is they have these special features to their culture. And one is, it's a culture of O.R.E. O.R.E. is referring to destiny. And so the Yorubas say, and by the way, the Igbo believe the same thing. The Kemites had their term Ka, which meant destiny. The Yorubas say, when the spirits were in heaven, they picked their destiny in the presence of God. They picked the parents that they would be born to. They picked the trials that they would face. They picked their strengths and weaknesses. And then they forgot it. And the task in life was to remember it. But the idea of O.R.E. is that everyone has a unique set of gifts. Whether or not they are fulfilled is based on free will, hard work, and good character. Of course, we'd have to question this because there's some people doing very well in this world who don't work, have bad character, and are bleeding the planet Earth. And I know a lot of us believe sooner or later they're going to pay their dues. I think it would be better sooner than later on this earth rather than in heaven. But the point about the Yoruba is they believe that the uniqueness of each person is extremely important. So their aesthetic concept derives from this. And it comes from a term called Iwa, I-W-A, Liwa, L-W-A. And what does this mean? It means that character is beauty. Character is beauty. Now I want to say something here. Their concept of aesthetics is not moral. It's descriptive. And so what they mean by that is that the artist, the singer, the drummer, the musician, the painter, that captures the essence of whatever it is they're singing about, carving about, or dancing about, then that is Ila Iwa. It is beauty for them because it has captured the essential quality of that being. It could be the ugliest creature on earth. It's not a question of how it looks. It's a question of what it is. And we have a saying in African American culture. It says, every tub stands on its own bottom. It's non-judgmental. I know a brother who would say this to his family, and the family, made up of a lot of Christian women, was very judgmental of their older brother who was a gambler. out in the Bayou Fort Orche of Louisiana, where voodoo is strong. He was a gambler. He had women all over the place, and they saw that as sinful. But his younger brother, who was head of the family, said, every tub has its own bottom. That's the essence of him. He gambles. He likes pretty women. That's the way he is. Capture that, and that's beauty. So, ila iwa, or the essential nature of a thing, which is beautiful. Ila iwa is best embodied in the spiritual blues because it captures the essential nature of this new African, this African in America. Because this African in America underwent stress and strain where we just couldn't take the culture of Africa and just drop it here as Africans could do in the Caribbean and have a hybrid culture where on the one hand it's basically African and then there's a European one on the side, but the African one is predominating over the European one, but they both exist side by side. We didn't have that opportunity to just take the whole culture and drop it here. We had to struggle to recreate it. And so as I pointed out before, the ethos or the way of life, what's unique about us as a people is creativity. And we're the most creative Africans, and I believe the most creative people on the planet, not because we came here more creative, but because the circumstances demanded that in order for us to continue, we would have to go inside our soul and take what was old and create something new. That was new African culture. And that's the art form, the foundation of which is the spiritual blues. And so this uniqueness describes us. Now, among the Kemites, they have something that explains this uniqueness. The people of Egypt, they called their beginning Sep Tepi, first occasion. And by that they meant the time in which there was nothing but a watery mass on the earth. It wasn't water, but like water, out of which emerges God, Ptah. So they have a philosophy of origin that precedes God. But the key thing is, it's a watery mass. And so what ends up happening with them, everything they did when it came to creation, they would always go back to that first occasion. If they built a pyramid, they would have water around it, reminding them of the watery mass. And by the way, the Mayan, one of the great civilizations of Mesoamerica, who were inspired by the Olmecs, who developed out of the 25th dynasty, some of them migrating into Mesoamerica and laying out the pattern for step pyramids. When the Mayans built pyramids, they'd always have a little water around it. They're going back to our first occasion. So when we look at any people, when it comes to how they create, they will usually go back into the depths of their soul and draw on their beginnings. Every people do this. They're not conscious of it. Europeans do it. I won't go into how they do it, but I know, I study them. You know what I mean? They'll go back to theirs. They ain't too pretty either. But they'll go back to their first occasion. And so, with us, a people who are creative, anytime we start on a new enterprise, whether it's political, whether it's social, whether it's artistic, whether it's poetic, whether it's musical, whether it's blacks in the Bronx, in the depths of the Bronx, where fires are burning everywhere, where everything is ugly, they come up with something beautiful. Hip hop, which is nothing but urban blues. But they went back to first occasion. The word, which is one of the first principles that come out of our culture. So if we look at our folks here, we go back always when we're starting on something new to the first occasion. And what was that first occasion for us? A slave narrative described it this way. They were talking about the music, but it is a paradigm for the culture in general. When creating a new music, one enslaved African said, we think of a sound of Africa, and then we recreate it on the spur of the moment. The spur of the moment. What this tells you about the African is, in order to create and recreate a culture here, we had to go inside our souls, draw on what we had, and come up with something new. But it was in the moment. It was spontaneous. And I should also say, as this culture was developed, it became organized, because it always goes more than one way. But spontaneity is the favorite thing in our culture. When Miles Davis would go into a recording studio, and this took great courage because he was a great innovator. Innovator means he created new schools of music, and absolutely beautiful. He had this beautiful melodic sound, kind of blue. Wasn't just one of the best-selling jazz records, but one of the most beautiful. Miles would go into a recording studio, and he had nearly lost his voice because he had had a operation on his lungs, and he was told not to talk loud, but Miles had to talk loud. And when he raised his voice, he lost most of it, so he'd always do this thing of, he'd come into a studio and say, good music starts with what you know, and you rise above yourself. And so, spontaneously, going into a studio with maybe 4 notes, he'd come up with some of the most beautiful music ever, because he piped in to the feelings of the moment. Because the spiritual blues comes from the feelings of everyday black folks. The spiritual blues is not something planned that somebody just laid out on a sheet of paper. The spiritual blues has this quality, as Zora Neale Hurston said. She said, as a group bent on feeling, not sound effects. Because the feelings come from your soul. One of the things about the spiritual blues that's interesting, it's the same thing of all the other forms of the music and the culture, is dissonance. One of the beauties of it is, unlike European classical music that's all in one line, all the same, will put you to sleep, you've got harmonies that don't mix, because you got different people breaking in. You understand? Because it's a music conceived by the group. Because African culture and New African culture is democratic. And the thing about the spiritual blues is it's got that bent note as opposed to that straight note. And only certain singers can sing that bent note. Aretha Franklin could sing it, not sing it. One of the greatest singers ever, Muddy Waters, who have over here, could sing it, because that bent note reflects the elliptical movements of the planets as they zig and they zag. And so it's a rough sounding note. And the spiritual blues is every singer coming in and bringing in their part, not prearranged. Pretty much the way gumbo's made, or pretty much the way any kind of change is made, we put our heads together and come up with something new. And so the spiritual blues comes from the heart of everyday black folks. It is an expression of their soul. And what's interesting about the spiritual blues is you can take some things that would normally not even be considered musical, coming out of sometimes places of pain. The moan, which is characteristic of all black music, but especially the blues and the spiritual blues. That moan. I've heard compositions just made up of the moan. And enslaved Africans would say, we moan so the devil wouldn't understand what we're singing. And they weren't Christians. They meant the white boy, because they called him the devil. You hear me? But that moan is taking something that could have come from seeing some of the most horrible things and turning it into something beautiful. So it's everyday black folks who came from their souls and created this music, drawing from Africa, but adding something new. So the spiritual blues has that foundation. The spiritual blues has a twin sound. The spiritual blues comes out of a unified sound. It comes out of a philosophy of unicity that we talked about before, Ma'at. And so the authors of this didn't have the idea of the spiritual and the physical or material being separate. They were all one. And just as God among the Trois was a totality of force, the music of the spiritual blues, the music of our art form, and our culture in general is a 24/7 thing, one that you feel and live. In our culture, to know the truth is to be the truth. The best singer speaks from and sings from their soul. The best speaker does the same thing. In our culture generally, that's the requirement. So the blues is not Saturday music and the spirituals is not Sunday music. They're total. They cover every occasion. And the sensibilities that C.O.R.E talked about that's contained in the spiritual blues, that contained in all the art forms, talk about every situation. And not just about heaven. Every situation in life. So one of the questions is when we say that the spiritual blues is the mirror of a people's soul, what kind of people were these? What kind of people? Remember what Frederick Douglass said when he talked about his friends on the Freeland plantation. He said they were noble souls. Noble souls. One observer of black people during the period of enslavement was a woman named Elizabeth Kilham. It's a white woman. And her observation when she looked at black people was, she said, these are a people of greatness. These are a people of kindness, of feeling, of caring. And another one, her name was Elizabeth Alliston. She says, these are aristocratic people. And so what we have to understand is the spiritual blues comes from a people who were aristocratic. And they had this idea that they were noble. My mother was called Queen Sylvia by her friends. My godmother, when she was dancing one time and a brother was common with her, she said he was common, as though she was aristocratic. So the old folks came from that. So I want to conclude by saying this. The spiritual blues comes from an aristocratic people who come from a mindset that is twin, where the blues of the spirituals, good is bad, and God is everywhere. Thank you.
This mighty black culture has a national anthem, and it isn't the Star-Spangled Banner. It's the signature song of the spiritual blues. Oh, freedom.
Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. Before I'd be a slave, I'd be buried in my grave.
Dr. Oba T'Shaka is the author of 5 books, each of which is considered a masterwork. His first book grew out of his organizing in the Black Freedom Movement, entitled The Political Legacy of Malcolm X. Dr. T'Shaka's books on Malcolm X covers dimensions missed by Alex Haley's autobiography, and unlike Manning Marable's book, Malcolm X, A Life of Reinvention, which argues that Malcolm abandoned black nationalism by reinventing himself with a false narrative of his life. Dr. T'Shaka examines Malcolm's thoughts and shows that Malcolm did not reinvent himself. He transformed himself and remained not only a black nationalist, but broadened his revolutionary philosophy while working to radicalize the civil rights movement into a human rights movement. In this analysis, T'Shaka combines activism with scholarship and allows Malcolm to speak for himself. The Art of Leadership, Volume 1 and 2, are Oba T'Shaka's second and third books. They are the only books in the modern world today on African and African American leadership traditions and systems. These 2 volumes are used in Black Studies departments, seminary programs, churches, and community organizations in Africa, Britain, Holland, and the Caribbean, and throughout the United States. T'Shaka's 4th book, Return to the African Mother Principle of Male and Female Equality, is considered by scholars to be a classic because it is the only book to accurately define the paradigm or model for African and African American families. This is a paradigm that will provide balance for black and non-black male-female relationships. Dr. T'Shaka's 5th book, The Integration Trap, specifically the generation gap caused by a choice between 2 cultures, explains what has gone wrong in black families, communities, and nations since 1968 that has led to shifts in black values and behavior not arising from enslavement. T'Shaka shows that since 1968, powerful hostile forces have hit black communities and African nations, causing them to make a choice between 2 cultures, one African American and one European American. This book examines African and African American culture in depth, with a focus on how to rescue African American communities nationally and African nations globally. Currently, Dr. T'Shaka is writing his 6th and 7th books, tentatively entitled SIBA, Mastering Your Inner Light of Wisdom. This book covers the pedagogy or teaching method used in ancient African cultures and African American cultures to produce masters in all walks of life.